All right, we're going to get started. We do have a microphone up here, but it's fairly soft, so we're going to be projecting as well. Welcome and thank you to Pejepscot for coming to Pejepscot History Center's first History Happy Hour of 2023. This is something we had to stop doing during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, and we're happy to be once again putting it on. I'm Amy Keithan. I'm the Museum Services Manager at Pejepscot History Center. And for those of you, I know we have quite a few of you who have not been to our events before, and I just wanted to say welcome. We are the fourth oldest history center in the state. We were founded in 1888. And because of that, we feel that we have a duty to not only share the past, but question the past. Because we are so old, because we've got a lot of voices that haven't been questioned in our collections. So I wanted to also just have everybody recognize the staff that's here. So behind the video camera, we have Victoria Levesque. She's our development manager. And in the pink, walking around, there we go, at the back door is Larissa Biggie-Picard, who is our executive director. Keeping everything in order. Also wanted to say thank you to Nomad for hosting us tonight and providing pizza. And I think it's also really special that we get to experience this event in a building that has a 150-year tradition of textiles. The first mill was built on this site in 1809. And there was continuous textile production here on this site through to the 1950s. So this is just the perfect venue for lovers of textiles, I think. If you haven't already grabbed pizza, feel free to do so. You're welcome to get up and go grab another drink through the cash bar throughout the event. This is really casual. I want you to have a good time. There are a few items up here that you'll see from our panelists that they've brought in. And those are going to be available afterwards for you to come up and view a bit closer. But we do ask that you wash your hands first. There is a bathroom you can ask outside. And actually, some of those items are not touchable, so don't just go grabbing. I know we all want to do that. I was thinking, oh, this is getting kind of crowded up here with all of these things, and then I thought, oh, we're fiber artists. We can't go anywhere without bags of stuff. So we're all used to this. Program packets. In front of you all, you have a program packet that obviously has the night's events in it, but also has a free ticket to one of our historic house museums, along with the History Center, which has regional. Are you telling me to speak up, Larissa? I'm going to take it out. All right. Bear with me. Okay. Hi. We have two historic house museums along with our regional history center where we do exhibits, and we also have things for research, researching local history as well. But we'd love it if you could come along and visit one of our museums this summer. We have the Joshua Chamberlain Museum, and we also have the Schofield Whittier House Museum, which is a time capsule house. Actually, the family didn't live there full-time past 1925, so everything is just as it is. What else? Upcoming programs. I also wanted to let you know that there's a membership form in there, and that's because if you were a member, you would be getting a discount here, and you would also get free admission to the museums that I mentioned year-round, and free members-only events as well. But we do have some upcoming programs that I wanted to tell you about. The first one is coming up on April 27th, and it is called Here First, Samoset and the Wowenock of Pemaquid, Maine, and it's a talk and book signing by the author Jody Batchelder of the same book of the book of the same name that I just mentioned. Our next History Happy Hour, if you have a good time tonight, is called Steps in Time, Dance as Cultural Performance. and June Vale is doing that. That's on May 11th at 5:30. That will also probably include a signature cocktail because it's held at the Pejepscot History Center, and we have a fun time coming up with thematic cocktails for our history happy hours that we have at our place. And then the other thing I wanted to let you know about is that our first exhibit of the year is going to be opening on Memorial Day weekend, and that is called Artful, The Creative Life of Eugenie Schofield Whittier. And that's on the back of your program as well. But Eugenie lived in the house that I mentioned. That's one of our historic house museums. Like many Victorian women, she was a painter, but she was extremely skilled. And she got married and sort of had to give into the societal pressures of becoming a mother and a wife, but she didn't give up her art. She actually just put it into other creative outlets, and so we'll be showing those, some never-before-seen collection items. And all of our exhibits are free, so we'll hope you'll be able to come and visit us and see that. Finally, before I talk about the actual evening, I just want to say thank you, a special thank you to PHC's wonderful volunteers who this event, or indeed PHC, wouldn't even exist without. Everything that you see here tonight, the programs, everything, people signing you in, those are all volunteers, and they're wonderful. And if any of you are interested in volunteering, we have a textile collection of thousands of items, so we always have something for people to do if you're interested in volunteering. Right, so on to tonight's events. So our theme for this year is Fine Folk, Critiquing Our Artistic Past. And we wanted to do this because we have so many beautiful, artistic, creative items in our collections, but we wanted to question what gets considered creative and an art, and what is sort of dismissed. So it's just as much about what is art, who produces art, and who art is for, as it is who isn't it for, who isn't included as an artist, and therefore what art gets pushed under and ignored. And so because of that, and because of my own love of textiles, I'm a knitter and a spinner, I thought that this would be a really good way to talk about textiles. So textiles have a rich history, and it sort of skirts the edges of fine arts. And a lot of that has to do with who did textiles and what they were for. So we thought we would get some wonderful experts together who could talk to us not only about the history of their craft, but also about contemporary experiences to see how those have changed and how they haven't changed. So first we're going to hear a little bit from each of the panelists about their particular area of expertise. And then we're going to do a panel question for all of us to talk about up here about issues in the textile arts. And then after that, we are going to open it up from questions from the floor. So the program will go until about 7 o'clock tonight. If you have to leave early, that's fine. Feel free to nip out. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, who's Christine Maki. She's the executive director of Maine Fiber Arts. That's a statewide arts nonprofit that she founded in 2000. It's based right over in Topsom, and the organization promotes Maine artists through gallery exhibits, tour maps, networking, referrals, publications, photo illustrated stories. They have 2 websites, mainefiberarts.org and the mainfiberfolio.com. And they're both really beautiful websites. And they welcome visitors at their Topsom site as well. Fiber arts there include spinning, knitting, weaving, quilting, felting, embroidery, mixed media, and other mediums. Christine herself is a craftswoman who spins, knits, and sews, and is also an avid photographer. So with that, I am going to hand this over to Christine. Do you want me to set that up for you?
That would be great.
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. And while she's getting that ready to go, I want to say that we are working on a project right now that involves history. And it's called The Story of Fiber Art in Maine During the Past Half Century as Told by the Artists. So if anybody wants to come visit us in Topsom and tell us your story, or if they have people that you know. I've been working with Carol Jones from Bootenham, who is a sheep farmer and an apple guru for at least 15 years now. And one day we counted up and we realized, oh, we have been around for 50 years now. So surprise, surprise, it's really a hop, skip, and a jump, and here we have it. But tonight I want to show you slides of Maine work. And starting off, as was said, Maine Fiber Arts is just around the corner, just across the street. And we have a gallery where we show work. And this is a beautiful cypress after Van Gogh that Janet Connor did. And we do gallery exhibits. So here's one we had of contemporary work. And Susan Carlson's portraits in the beginning, quilts, book arts, paper show that we just had last year, Maine Indian basketry we did. We had about 100 baskets and it was one of our most popular shows. People really loved seeing old and new. We did do a show of Maine history and its influence in contemporary work. We also do books and publications, a fiber art master's book. We profiled 20 people. There's a 2-page spread of Jill Vendatuli. And we've done a learning fiber art guide, 100 places where you could study fiber arts in Maine. We still have copies of that. This was taken at Haystack with my knitting mentor, Catherine Covey. And if you look at the ropes on one side, maybe we can kill a few more lights. Okay.
It's very visible from the back, I can tell you. It's very visible.
Well, that's just shows how she used to teach knitting. And that's actually a stockinette stitch, 3 stitches and 10 rows. So she was very inventive. And another page from that learning guide, we do tours to studios and farms. This was a big kiosk we put in a visitor center. And we've done printed maps, and now we've moved them online, and we do mini tours. We have one to Midcoast, Maine, and the new one just came out last month to Western Maine. And so that helps with our statewide mission, and we get to take many trips and go see shops and studios and have a good time. And we have 2 websites, and you can find the story of fiber that I talked about initially on our Fiber Folio website. Sometimes we take the show on the road. We used to go to Common Ground Fair, and that's Catherine teaching spinning to crowds of folks. And she used to bring these big, beautiful coffee table art books for people to be inspired. We do gatherings that COVID has stopped a bit, and we have an online shop. So I want to talk about what fiber art is. I'm saying you guys can't see the show, but you can. So it's knitting. This is a cloak that Catherine made with a motif of a snake, and she worked with that snake for 2 years. She just put it in other pieces that she would think about, and she liked to work deeply. Beautiful, woven by Emi Ito, and a crocheted cup. Fiber art is crochet. This is paper piecing. Talk about hours and hours. Jumchi, a type of manipulation of fiber and making papers. This is beautiful. 2 pieces, one detail by Sarah Haskell of tapestry weaving. And the first says, I can't read it here from this angle. What if our bodies knew they are made of elements begun as stars? And the detail shows her, her command of her craft. She had done discharged dyes and woven work. It's really gorgeous. And the piece on the bottom is when a friend of hers passed, and she just named it There You Go. And it's collage work. And this is basketry. A woman wanted to talk about the pain in her knee, Catherine Harding. Her doctor didn't believe her, so she made him a piece. And this is handmade books. And this garment, two women from Farmington are doing the books and the garments. One woman leaned over the bookmaker and said, hey, if you did that on fabric, I could use it.
Oh my God.
So now they're making these beautiful pieces. A felted piece and a felted sculptural piece by Deborah Friedman. Again, Sarah Haskell. And that on the right-hand side is white fiber is all shifu, hand-spun paper, woven into the piece. And there's a fashion show that takes place right in Fort Andros, Altered Couture, and I went behind the scenes to photograph people. That was a lot of fun. A paper sculpture that appeared in our show, Weaving by Mary Chason. And this piece is needlepoint and talks about the big waves that hit Katrina. Hand-spun yarn. A big pink rhinoceros we once had in our gallery. Susan Carlson did the work, and it's just thousands and thousands of little pieces of pink fabric. Anne Frank and Adolf Hitler in a piece woven by Barbara Burns. Paper books and quilts. And this is a Down East netting stitch the fishermen use in Vinyl Haven that Stephanie Crossman learned from her grandmother, and now she's making other kinds of objects and bugs and beautiful work. Hooked rug after Paul Gauguin, an iron with embroidery on it, Jill Snyder Wallace. And this woman came in to us one day and said, I have some knitted tams in the car. Would you like to see? And in came a plastic tub, and there must have been 75 of these things that she had just been knitting in the last 4 months. We said, wow, way to go. And fiber art can be as comfortable as a baby blanket. So I want to take you on a little tour around Maine. So Richard Lee was my partner, paper maker, had a gorgeous studio in Richmond in the Ames Mill. He has since passed, as has Catherine Colby, my knitting mentor. And that's her piece of hand-spun yarn called Ritual Against Homelessness. So talking about what fiber can speak of, she loved, I have a slide of garments she used to start with, but she soon went into sculptural work. And this was about the Gulf War. Cormorant, black plastic. She told me, forget patterns, study shape. And this is her boat with 4 figures. That means more to me as every year goes by. The first woman is seated, and there are others that are looking up into the sky, very hopeful. And it's all hand-spun yarn. And she thought about how to make it into a boat shape and came up with a fiber solution. So there's fun behind the scenes. Tapestry weaver right in Cundy's Harbor. In Roslyn, this is after Guernica, Picasso. People seated at Museum of Modern Art. And we decided to make a show of hooked rugs after master paintings. And the first person came in and said, I have a Picasso. So we said, okay. So Nina Ruitt has a farm, and she's a knitter. And if you've never been to a shearing, now is the time in early April. And it's really fun, and it always ends up with a big feast. Marion Brown in Belfast. We went on a little journey to do a dye workshop on Vinyl Haven with indigo and onion skins. Susan Mills is a felter right in Bowdoin. And we toured a home of a collector in Boston. Arlene was delivering a paperwork. So we got to see this great house. And here's another home right in Brunswick. He collects antiques, and she collects paintings by Maine artists. Marlena Gorberek has passed also. She was in Bath with this beautiful studio of found objects and handmade books. And Susan Carlson had an addition put onto her studio so she could make this 23-foot-long crocodile. It was never a dull moment. Elizabeth Bush, up in Glenburn, just around Bangor, magnificent quilts. And Anne Fox, who likes to spend the winters dyeing. In the spring and summer, she's a master gardener. And it's the only place I've seen in Maine where there were artichokes. Really great artichokes. I lost my right arrow. Hillary Hutton, longtime weaver. Emmy Ito, right in Bath, very innovative work. On the left, that's a piece of double knitting, and we have one on the table. And Stephanie Lett is right in our audience tonight. I saw her wave. And she's a wonderful silkscreen artist and quilter, freeform quilting. And this was a great big rug that I think she did finish. Out of t-shirts, is that what it was? She'll have to tell us. And Maine College of Art is another place to tour. They now have an apparel department. I went through the Maine Quilt Show that happens every year in Augusta. Sensational work. This was made by a woman in Australia. They had a special theme for women. Maine Indian basket makers. Jeremy Fry took this to Santa Fe and got $12,000 for these baskets. Wow. The basket makers have really worked on elevating awareness for what goes in, from starting with the tree. And here's another sensational piece. Sarasok Basin. I almost brought this piece tonight because I'm house sitting for someone and she has the little blue one. But I just said, nah, too precious, too precious. And we did just complete a piece exploring fiber in Western Maine. Here's some of the scenes and shops you can take in. We visited rug hookers, and somebody was teaching how to hook an eye with the catch light by working on that dog. And you know, these are the pieces. When I went into this church, they had hooked rugs on the floors, on the tables, on the stage. They had never seen each other's work. And they said, we have this stuff in closets. You know, and out comes this stuff that belongs in a Smithsonian museum. This is the history of the lobster company her family has. A beautiful piece. And yeah, this woman always has her signature of a little hummingbird. And a great piece, we said, that's it, we got to have this at Maine Fiber Arts. We gave her a show. Grace Collette. Sarah Hodgkiss in Waldoboro. Susan Ferrara, another master hooker, right here in Harpswell. Amazing. And Arlene Morris. I did bring several of her pieces on the table. And so for coming up, wow, we're having a show of braided rugs in May and June. And several of the braiders got together and are gifting us this gorgeous color wheel rug to auction or raffle off for our benefit. So, we also do photography for artists and make these storyboards where people can show off their work. This is my tip of the evening if you have to photograph your own work. Volume 1, Volume 2 of the Rug Hooking Magazine has the best articles I've ever found. I'm in 2 camera groups and study it. That's a treasure. Online we do some tutorials, and I told you about the story project, and that's my last image. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. That was really wonderful. So, as you can see, we started with someone who has vast experience of contemporary fiber arts, and there is a growing movement to consider all of the work that was put into it, and that helps increase, I think, the perception of it as art, but we'll talk about that more later as well. And one of the places that Christine mentioned was Maine College of Art and Design, and that brings us to our next presenter. Vivian Cunningham is a textile and fashion senior, almost finished, at Maine College of Art and Design, focusing on historical garment recreations. Hailing from Alabama, Vivian came to Maine with the intent of becoming a costume designer. Previous experience volunteering in history museums led them to internships with Atlantic Black Box, Maine Historical Society, and cemented their interest in historic textiles and costumes. Currently, they work within the Maine Historical Society's collection as a collections assistant, was involved in the Northern Threads exhibit that was recently up, and as a museum assistant at the Tate House Museum. So I will leave it to Vivian and to talk a little bit about textiles and historic costumes.
Thank you so much for having me. So as I said, I'm Vivian Cunningham, and while I am in the Fashion and Textiles Department at the Maine College of Art and Design, I do focus on the reproduction of 1920s clothing that I have been doing since my freshman year. I've been interested in history since I was a little girl. In fact, at just a few weeks old, my mother's maternity leave was up, and I made home in a rather large desk drawer at the house museum she was director of. In fact, at this point, I think I've spent more times in museums than not. However, I haven't just been surrounded by museum collections with items that I couldn't touch. I've been surrounded by generations of family items that have been built, lovingly budgeted for, crafted, and later saved for future family members. Most of my dress-up days were spent in my grandmother's wardrobe, playing in clothes that her own mother had made. I still have a lot of those clothes, and I even wear them as she would have. Being around these garments and later traveling with my mom to estate sales, saving antique and vintage pieces, I learned my own variations of conservation for these garments in our private collection, as well as teaching myself to pull patterns from and remake the most fragile of pieces. And even though I came here to Maine for school, I just couldn't stay out of museums. And one of my proudest accomplishments, as was mentioned, was collectively becoming a part of the Maine Historical Society, Tate House Museum, and Victoria Mansion in parts of their curation, collections, and conservations teams. Particularly at MHS, where I was brought on and later absorbed as collections assistant, was to build mannequins used to display the Society's garments in the popular Northern Threads exhibit, covering 200 years of dress in Maine. With the help of Abby Soldowski, we covered almost 120 bodies, made sure the corresponding garments were stable, and later dressed them for exhibition. The whole experience was exhilarating, and to see people become excited over a subject that is my passion was really fulfilling. But I also had the opportunity to make a piece for display. Oh, it's not good. Sorry. Oh no. Okay, there we go. An 1870s corset to be paired with an extant bustle cage, filling a gap in the Society's collection and a visual gap in the exhibit's structural garments. Given the opportunity to actually craft an item and have it seamlessly fit among pieces that were 150 years older really helped me find a way to blend my artistic self and historian. As I stand here today, I'm a fashion historian and historical costumer who loves and anticipates to recreate clothing from all eras. And as you've seen, I have the 18th century Italian Renaissance, 19th century corsetry under my belt. And of course, as I've mentioned, I focus on the reproduction of 1920s clothing. The glamour and luxuriousness has been too appealing to pull away from. At first, it was something that helped me stand out as an artist, and it was something I was confident in my knowledge of. As an individual who's been homeschooled their entire life, the adventure of college took on a whole new meaning, and instead of knowing the ins and outs of popular culture, I knew the ins and outs of my new pieces of history. However, my reasons for continually choosing the 1920s is not only because of my love for the era or the visuals and clothing styles, but also because of the restraints of my personal practice. As I mentioned before, I know my way around the era, and as a creator who values the history behind the work just as much as the work itself, the knowledge of what I'm making is very important. Therefore, research is, and always has been, a significant component about who I am as a creator, both in art and museum. I take care in the details of my pieces rather than their originality. The level of detail often extends to or even revolves around a location, a pair of shoes, or a set of jewelry that my garments are set in or accessorized with. The research elements are crucial because I spend just as much time learning about how those before me would have constructed a silhouette, what fabrics they might have used, or even where the garment would have been worn to, as I do to complete a piece. I strive not only to recreate a garment, but also to recreate its character. I want my pieces to look as much as I would like the wearer or the viewer to feel that it belongs in another era. I could not recreate 1920s clothing just by looking at an extant dress and then applying the techniques that I've learned from my professors. The new piece might look similar, but they cannot successfully carry the provenance. Sorry, too many devices here. One artist in particular that has continued to inspire me and help me continue as a historical costumer is a UK-based dressmaker named Isabella Pitcher. While she doesn't recreate Art Deco garments, she does the most beautiful reproductions of garments ranging from medieval to Edwardian. On the bio of her page, Pitcher states that her garments are based on primary resources. Her subsequent photographs of the finished pieces, you can see her dedication to the craft of visual reproduction. This is a craft that I aim for in my own practice. Pitcher's mission statement speaks to me because she is not only defining herself as an artist, creating one-of-a-kind works for the masses, but rather she is creating as an artist who carefully researches each piece and she is creating and aims for it to seamlessly fit into its predetermined era. Her work is not awe-inspiring because of its originality, but rather because of its attention to detail and credence given to the original designers. It is with the same confidence, knowledge, and authenticity that I want to bring to my own work. Both Pitcher and I create not to uncover, but to teach those that has been forgotten.
That was really wonderful. Thank you very much. And I think there's a lot of meat. It's you. The person we had to drag in from eating pizza is next. That was really wonderful, Viv. I think there's a lot of meat in what Viv just said that we're going to talk about in terms of why we create and what makes a creation art, detail, etc. So the next presenter is Lori Labar. She's the Chief Curator of History and Decorative Arts at Maine's largest history museum. Perhaps you've heard of it, the Maine State Museum. Curators tell stories in 3 dimensions, she says, and in Lori's case, these stories about Maine's people and the way they've lived in the past. So Lori has written Maine Quilts, 250 Years of Comfort and Community. That's her 3rd book. We do have copies, signed copies of that for sale tonight if you're interested. An exhibit of the same name will open at the Maine State Museum when it reopens in 2025. It's currently closed for renovations, but it's getting there. And during the closure, Lori and her colleagues are planning updates to existing exhibits and also designing new ones. So Lori, as a textile historian, has a vast wealth of knowledge that she's going to share a little bit of tonight.
Thank you, Amy. So before I get started, this is a detail from a study quilt that I made based on an 1830s quilt in the Maine State Museum collections, and the quilt is right here. This near one is the one that I worked on. So these are study quilts, and in 2016, a friend was organizing a show of study quilts at the Maine Quilt Show that you just mentioned. And let's see, the top quilt is in our collection, and a study quilt is inspired by an antique quilt. The interpretation is about a quarter the size of the original. And so Cindy asked me to make a quilt for the show, and I agreed, forgetting for a moment that I had never made a quilt. And I'd sewn, but I never made a quilt. And so, and this process got me, of course, then it had to be good enough to be in a show. What was I thinking? And this process got me really hooked. So here I am with some of my study materials. The original is behind us, and then on the lower picture there's the original and then my little study quilt. And where you see an accession number, that's how we keep track of objects in our collection. And so this piece came in 2004. Where are the buttons? Here they are. So I'm a weaver and I'm a silversmith. I paint and now I quilt as well. And my, here we go, silversmith. Shameless self-promotion here. And my work as an artist informs my work as a curator. So what is a curator? Well, curators choose objects that come into a museum collection. And this is an upper, I thought I was going to have a little gizmo here to point things. So in the upper right, that's the paperwork for a new incoming object. In this case, it's a woven bolero made by a Penobscot couple, DeConti and Brown. Let's see, so curators choose the objects that come into a museum collection. They determine the content of exhibits, and the lower left is uncommon threads about Wabanaki textiles, clothing, and costume. And as a result of these things, curators are writing all the time, and sometimes, a lot of times, it's labels, and labels are like haiku. You have to get to distill everything you want to say into 25 words or less about an object, and that's very hard. And some of us also write books where you need to be concise, but not that concise. And these three are my books. And I was in, how did I get here? So I was an archaeologist for 20-something years, and so that's me up in Newfoundland in 2021, and I'm holding a polar bear effigy, the only chert polar bear effigy ever found in Newfoundland. And so if you want to get me going on that, I'll talk about that afterwards. But my specialty was actually prehistoric textile and pottery technology in the Northeast. So I've actually been a textile geek for a very long time. And when I discovered museum work, I went to graduate school at Winterthur in Delaware. So that's outdoor scene, that's the library at Winterthur. I'm on the estate. And on the inside is a quilt in one of their rooms. Most history is document-based, as we know, so it reflects the people who wrote the documents, and though they were mostly upper middle class white men. So studying material culture, and material culture is just a fancy way to say the things we make and use. So studying material culture is one way to add to history the voices of women, immigrants, the middle class, and any other underrepresented group. And that is why I love it so much. So for the last 10 plus years, I've been researching Maine quilts to show how they can inform history. I call it quilt speak. Reading quilts can be tricky. You need to be able to date the quilts from their fabric when there is no inscription, which is most of the time. And quilts reflect, but it's worth doing, in my mind anyway, because quilts reflect how the textile industry, for example, transformed Maine demographics, transformed Maine geographically, how it changed settlement patterns. Inscribed quilts can reveal how communities included some people and excluded others. And one quilt in the Maine State Museum's collection demonstrates that the Portland Girls' School gave its students an excellent education in literature. And I could just go on about the fun things that you can find by studying quilts. And it doesn't look as bad as that, honest. So quilt research can illuminate common threads between the past and the present. And oh, bummer, I had a newer version of this. Oh well, you'll have to make, I'll wing it. So these two are antique quilts. The left one is from 1804 and the right one is from the late 1800s. But quilts that are traditional quilts made today would look almost identical. And so in the version that I have on my thumb drive, which I forgot to send you a new version of, all I did is took a couple pictures from the web of modern quilts that look just like these. So imagine, if you will, something that just looks a little cleaner and has a nice photography on a bed. So that's what those look like. So the images of, and then there's the quilters who are, so they're still modern. One of the things I really enjoy is being able to see what is happening today that still resonates and has been carried forward from the past. And so that was one of these things, that people are still making traditional quilts. People who, and quilters seem to fall into sort of three categories in my mind. And one of them is the traditional people who they just want something pretty to keep them warm in bed. And the prettier the better, and their ideas of pretty are very different one from another, and that's what the beautiful quilts do. And then there's sort of quilters who innovate a little, and who are, or a lot, and who are neo-traditionalists, and they riff off traditional methods and patterns and designs. So in this case, the quilt that's the upper left, that's the one that was made in 1864 in Portland, and is made by students and alumni of a girls' school. And we were able to, its dates, the dates on it are June 1864. And it looks a little dirty, but that's because that's all inscriptions. and includes inscriptions for things that were published as late as May 1864 from a literary magazine. So these women are reading up-to-date stuff with this education from this girls' school. So the rest of these quilts were made in the last 20 years. And in fact, the one on the lower right is made by Sarah Smith, and you showed a Sarah Smith a tree in the winter. So these either reference motifs, upper right, those are motifs that were used historically, or they and some techniques that were used historically, or they reference construction techniques that have been used for decades and decades, as the pieces on the lower left. So those I consider that sort of neo-traditionalism. And then there's quilters for whom artistic expression is foremost, and you are going to recognize at least two of the bottom three of these artists in here. So the fact that the medium is a quilt is almost immaterial, and the pun was not intended. So this example on the top is from 1868. So the term art quilt didn't get, that was from what, 1974, 1984? Can't remember, late 70s, mid 70s to the early 80s. And in fact, the quilt on the very bottom center, Gail Frass and Duncan Slade, they had a quilt in that exhibit where the term art quilt was coined. But the top quilt, I would argue, is also an art quilt. And this is from 1868, and it is from Alexander, Maine, which is way down east. And I just can't get over how much it reminds me of 1968, not 1868. I mean, those suns look like some sort of psychedelic art from the 60s. So I think in this case, it was all about expression. On the lower left is someone that you should know about. Her name is Jude Spax. You don't know, she's wonderful. Belfast. Yeah, and then on the right is Susan Carlson, who did that amazing 20-something long life-size crocodile and pink rhino. She's amazing too. So coaxing the common threads of history from these quilts has been fascinating and rewarding. And it's certainly a lot more fun than this slide of one of my spreadsheets suggests. So this is I'm working on. So I'm still working on this project, and this is going, I hope, be an article in a peer-reviewed journal in a year or two. So from prehistoric weaving, which is on the upper left, to contemporary quilts, this piece was completed in 2019. Textiles have been central to our lives, and they are ubiquitous, and so they're taken for granted. But you can really tell a lot about a culture by studying textiles, and I've been privileged to spend so much of my career studying them and making them. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Lori. It was really great for you to so deliberately and clearly connect the past with current practice in that way, and that's what we're going to get into in more detail. Yeah, that's what we do, exactly. So our last presenter is Alicia Plummer. She's a knitwear designer living in Midcoast, Maine. She's a lover of literature and storytelling in all forms, and she transcribes metaphors and stories through texture and stitch, drawing inspiration from personal experiences, memories, and feelings. When she's not knitting, she's busy renovating her mid-1800s home, spending time with her family exploring the outdoors or reading. She also loves animals and hugs. I can attest that her animals are adorable. And you can find her on Instagram at Alicia Plums. She's also the co-author of the book Plum Dandy Knits. So I'll hand it over to Alicia.
Hello everyone, I am so excited to be here, and as you're going to see from my talk, I'm maybe a little bit more informal than these incredible ladies here. That is because I actually have a background in elementary education and not in knitwear design, and one of the things that I love so much about the knitting industry and the expansion of it through the internet is the accessibility and the way that it opens doors from people all over the world to connect through these common threads. It's just incredible. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the history of knitting because when Amy asked me to speak, she said this is a component, and the teacher in me said, okay, I can do this. So we can't really talk about knitting without talking about nail binding. And nail binding is a very, very ancient way of creating a fabric that uses one needle and a very long piece of thread, and the entirety of the length of thread has to be drawn through each loop while creating. Our oldest fragments were found in 5600 BCE in Israel. These are red socks from Egypt, and they were found and dated to about 300 to 500 AD. Now, the interesting thing about socks being the key thing that we're finding historically, as you see, this is more socks coming up now, is that the knitted fabric is very special in its ability to stretch. And some knitted fabric can even stretch to accommodate something up to 500 times its diameter, depending on the material and the crimp in the fiber, which is really fascinating. Now, this is an absolute problem solver for old cultures and ancient cultures that had people of all different shapes and sizes, and people with feet of all different shapes and sizes. Having something that can accommodate different body parts very easily allows for widespread creation, and is very helpful. So the oldest remnants that we have, these socks. Now, looking at this, you're gonna say this is one of the oldest remnants that was found. And what's interesting is the intricacy. This is the oldest dated piece of knitting we have that is not nail binding. These materials are so biodegradable. Temperature, sunlight, moisture, it's going to break it all down. So this was found in an Egyptian tomb, and the intricacy here and the fact that it is a sock which accommodates, has anybody here ever knit a sock? Raise your hand. Yes, so you know how to turn heels and what a pain it is to get that shaping in there. That really leads us to believe that knitting was actually performed far before this. Right? Because all of these different techniques and mechanisms had to be developed to get to this point. We just don't have the physical evidence necessarily. Next, we're going to go to Europe because as trade and expansion heads westward, this pillow was found in the tomb of an infant prince. Now, I actually have a little swatch. Amy, if you wouldn't mind handing that swatch around. I do have something you can touch. Your hands don't have to be washed. It's okay. This is a swatch, and this is something that I use when I'm first writing a knitting pattern. It involves a lot of math. Do you want to know what I majored in? English. Everybody's laughing right now. I'm laughing at myself because I used to always grow up saying, I'm not going to do any math. I'm going to be teaching English to kids. I don't need to pay attention right now. Well, a little bit of irony for you. So basically, what this little swatch does is I will pick a special yarn and a special needle, and I will cast on and just knit a little bit in whatever kind of pattern that I'm using for my fabric. The complete math comes out in that when I measure, you know how when you look very closely at a piece of knitting, there's little V's in there? That's called your gauge, and the number of V's in 1 inch is what all the math in the entire pattern is based off of. Okay, when you're looking at this pillow that was hand knit back in the 13th century, this is at a gauge of 20 stitches to the inch. The gauge that I'm passing through the room right now is 4.5 to 5 stitches to the inch, maybe. So even the most intricate knitting patterns that you're going to find right now, maybe 8 to 10 stitches to the inch at the most. I have something up there that is 8 stitches to the inch, and that's on very tiny needles. So the amount of time and craftsmanship that would go into a piece like this is absolutely astounding. It's also worthy to note that these pieces were knit with cotton and silk, which has little to no elasticity, which means little to no room for error. If you're knitting with more than one color, the colors will pull and bunch unless you are very good at what you're doing. Another thing that's really fascinating and that demonstrates the Arabic roots of knitting in general is that all knitting is worked from right to left, just like an Arabic text is. And some of these old samples actually have Arabic words knitted right into them. Through expansion, we see Muslim knitters being employed by Spanish Christian royal families. And we see a lot of royal families starting to hire knitters because these pieces are beautiful and they're very fine and it's very prestigious. We don't know what gender those knitters were, but we do know that knitting guilds surfaced around Europe in the 12 to 1700s. This was a male-only trade because it was considered a trade. Women were not allowed. It took 3 to 6 years to become a journeyman. The first 3 years were typically the apprentice doing things like scrubbing the home of the master knitter. If any of you are interested, I am taking offers. They had to create things like a cap, a jacket, gloves, etc. And, something really simple and basic like this wall hanging. To be considered a master knitter, they would then get to name their price, which is usually very high to create these works. After that, Queen Elizabeth really loved silk stockings. William Lee approached her and said, hey, I created this knitting machine. It's awesome. We can churn out all these stockings. Now, the stockings were coarser than what the hand knitters could do. They weren't as fine. But she rejected it and basically said, no, I'm actually really concerned that the economy of my country is going to suffer very deeply if this instrument takes hold, because all of these hand knitters are going to be completely out of a job. So she was actually looking out for the economy of her country. Henry IV of France, however, found it very interesting, supported the machine, and kind of financed it. William Lee passed away before it was widespread, but then his apprentices took it, and it kind of blossomed out from there. After that, hand knitting and individual knitting kind of sank again with the introduction of this machine, especially in Pennsylvania. And then we're going to jump forward to the 1920s, and high fashion is coming into play. Coco Chanel, I learned so much about her, and she's an absolutely fascinating woman. One of the reasons that she liked to design was because she wanted women to have the freedom and movement in their bodies that men had. One of the ways that she achieved this was a lot of use of jersey fabrics and knitted fabrics. Wool was considered a luxury at this time, and because it's high fashion, she started pulling in more wool. So where we were seeing cotton and silk being used before, now we're seeing more wool. Hand knitting and machine knitting were both big during this time, especially with the wars that happened. And companies started expanding to meet the demand that was happening, both in tools and yarn. And during the Great Depression and World War II, a lot of things were knit and then unraveled and reknit, and it was make, do, mend. This is when we also first saw synthetic yarns like acrylic come onto the scene. Acrylic is actually spun and created to mimic the natural properties of wool, believe it or not. The fibers are very lightweight, and so it is produced to mimic wool very, very closely. Now the difference being that wool will still retain body heat even sopping wet, and acrylic will not. So if you're a sailor wearing a wool sweater and you are absolutely soaked on the ship, that wool is actually still going to hold the heat. Wool can also absorb, is it 50 to 100% of its own weight in water, but that's just an aside that I find very fascinating, along with the fact that it's antimicrobial. So synthetic yarns are introduced to kind of counteract the wool shortage, and they're pretty cheap too, so they're a lot more accessible for people. Knitting patterns are actually issued by the government for home production, and there was a big push for people to knit these things, send them to the troops, and this is where we really see the shift go from male to female in the knitting industry, because also keep in mind that most of these companies, whether it's yarn companies, knitting product companies, these were all owned by men. Okay, so now we're seeing the yarn and the needles kind of going back into the women's hands because all the men are overseas fighting the wars. Sweaters are now becoming a staple through fashion thanks to Coco Chanel, and that kind of took off. They called them jumpers at the time. Then we hit the 1960s and the 1970s, and we really see knitting explode on the runway. A lot of chevrons. I'm sure everybody remembers probably a lot of browns and golds and avocados. Knitting is introduced and taught in school to girls only, actually, as a useful skill. Hand knitting still remains popular at home because all of these people are like, this fashion is incredible, I want to reproduce this, but I certainly can't go buy this off the runway. So they go out, they buy the acrylic yarn, and they make the items. This is a great place to kind of stop and talk about health benefits of knitting, and the fact that with the invention of the internet became a mega connectivity. of the knitting industry. One of those things being a website called Ravelry, which if anybody uses Facebook, Ravelry is basically a Facebook for knitters, and instead of family photos, you are looking at people's finished hats, mittens, sweaters. How did they modify it? What size did they knit it in? Did they change the pattern? Did they use the suggested yarn? And you get to see something on an incredible variety of people. It's wonderful, and you can connect there on so many different things. So when I stayed home, my mother bought me a knitting pattern and kind of just showed up at my door and was like, here's a knitting pattern for your daughter. And I was like, okay. And anything I didn't know, I self-learned on the internet. And I found it so relaxing and calming that I started writing my own knitting patterns because there was nothing in the industry that really reflected things that I would wear. I'm a very casual person. I'm pretty messy, I'm late a lot, it's part of my charm. But I needed pieces that I could wear that represented me, and things that were really, really intricate and detailed and formal just aren't who I am as a person. So when I started writing those knitting patterns, people started buying them. And I remember feeling guilty and not valuing my own work as an artist. I have since grown out of that and now find that a knitted item is a canvas for me to tell a story. And it draws me back to my love of literature because growing up, I was an only child. I didn't have a lot of friends. I was bullied, so I loved books. I loved reading other people's stories and being able to connect with them and love them through learning their experience. Sharing my own through my pieces is the way that I can connect with other people. This shawl, I'm going to try not to cry, I designed when I had to sell my family cabin, and it was where I grew up with my father in the summers. He passed away in 2007, and so the eyelets represent the rainstorms that we used to listen to when I was a little girl. And they just become stronger and more frequent throughout the piece. It's a very simple piece. I design very accessible pieces, but I like that because that means that anybody can do it. Anybody, I've had so many people write to me and say, I knit this shawl when my mother was going through chemo, and I made this through a divorce because it doesn't take too much thought. Some pieces you need to be line by line. Some pieces you can just go, and this is one of those pieces. Another piece that I designed was when I got engaged to my husband, and it's called Starry Night. He was COVID positive. He proposed to me in my yard with PPE from 15 feet away. He brought my best friend to catch me when I crumpled to the ground crying. Because he told me he had COVID and then he proposed. And so the stars represent that night, but the quilt-like pattern represents the fact that my mother is a quilter and makes me feel safe and loved, and so does he. And so I incorporated those two pieces together for that particular design. This piece is very special to me, and it's up on display here. I grew up in Naples, Maine, lived there for most of my life, did not move here to Bath until 2 years ago. This is probably the most urban place I've lived. I've actually never moved as an adult. College doesn't count. So coming to a brand new community, moving to a place that's substantially more urban than anything that I grew up with, I was really struggling to reconcile the sadness in my heart from not being surrounded by the woods and the wildflowers and my maple trees. And my house has literally like little alleys on the sides of it. And then I read this article about rewilding, and I thought, I can take a piece of Naples and I can bring it here, and I can fill that little corner with Queen Anne's lace and yarrow and clovers if I want to. And so I invented a colorwork chart that represented some of those plants for me. This was my wedding shawl. And there's a lot of symbolism here too. If you look right along the edge, you can see that the little chevrons, those actually represent the mountains that my husband and I would hike together when we were dating. And then the chevrons right below those are actually birds, because for Christmas, he didn't have a lot of money, so he got me some bird feeders. And I have learned the older I get, the more I just want to watch birds. The more excited I get about birds. titmice and buntings and cardinals and pileated woodpeckers and all of it. It just brings me so much joy. So there's birds in there, and then it kind of, the lace morphs into oak leaves. And oak leaves are very, very special to me because when I went through my first divorce, the oak leaves that I had to rake up in my yard by hand became a symbol of strength for me because acorns are so tiny and the leaves are so fragile, but the tree is so strong. And the amount of pain that I went through just made me cling to those oak trees, and spending that time in nature and spending that time learning how to do the things for myself that I had never done, and saying, I'm going to be okay, I can do this. And so I put that into the edge of the shawl to remind myself, as much as you are in love, you will always have this strength that is within yourself. And that's about it.
Thank you, that was wonderful, and a really great perspective too, directly from another maker like Viv, but completely different perspectives. So we are going to have a bit of a discussion now, and we're going to ask some questions. We could keep going forever. We're running a little short on time, but we're going to get through a few of these discussion questions that we have here. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about is what has contributed to the textile arts, or your area of specialty in particular, not being seen as fine art in the past and even today? And I know that we touched on a little bit of that during this, but does anybody want to expand on that? Don't be shy.
Well, I think I went through it kind of in my intro, and what really sticks with me and why I make recreate and reproduce garments is, since we have started walking as humans, we've required clothing for ourselves. It is something everybody has, in varying levels of intricacy and how much it costs. But we all, besides, something having to be bought at LL Bean or at Rennie's, we don't think a lot about it, and it kind of shows who we are as a person. But besides that, we don't think about it. It's a necessity. And I think it's not thought of as an art because it's everywhere. And for some reason, we think that art has to be kind of a one-of-a-kind, and you can only find it in one place or made by one person. But I disagree, and it also comes from working in house museums and how our ancestors made art out of everyday objects, because if we had to use it, why not make it beautiful too? And I think we've really lost that in our modern age, with it having to be made fast and be made accessible really quickly. I don't want to ramble too much.
Well, I agree with you, and I think it's hard to see something as art when you can buy it for 99 cents at the dollar store. And so I think the whole fast clothing culture has definitely worked against that. And it's also there's privilege involved. It costs a lot of money if you're going to buy. I have some lovely hand-woven shirts that I absolutely adore, and I paid more money than I like to think about for those. They've also lasted me 20 years. So, but that's a privilege to be able to do that. I think there's also gender involvement here, that if it's something that's done, historically done by women, it's just sort of like, isn't that nice? So with quilting and that sort of thing, I mean, it was really not thought of, it's still in some ways not thought of as an art. There's still people who, dealers who don't ask any questions when they buy a quilt from a family. They don't say, who made this? And so even today, you buy things from dealers, and they don't want to tell you who made it. And that's very frustrating to me.
I also think there's definitely a bit of a patriarchal spin, right? So how many of you have ever thought of fashion as frivolous or shallow, or heard that perspective shared by somebody that you know? In some cultures, fashion and the way that we present ourselves is the only voice that women have. So if you are going to control that voice, the easiest way to do that is to dismiss it and devalue it. And I'm not saying that that happens everywhere all the time, but it's a pretty consistent kind of underlying vein that has kind of followed us up through time. And I would say also that like there's a little bit of classism too, even maybe left over from like Western expansion in Europe, and that the higher income families paid people to make those things for them. So if you're the person who is the laborer, you are less than, you are lower. But I think now today, especially with the internet and with the connectivity and communication and quality of items that we have now, I think it is beginning to be seen in a drastically different light, and that we are more viewed as artisans now than ever before, and also that we are willing to speak up and say, this is my art.
I'm one of those people who believe that art and craft are just vital like breath, and that we can't not do it. Just sometimes getting out of bed in the morning is a creative act. And I remember going to the Maine Arts Commission when I wanted to have shows. In 2004, we did the State of Fiber. We had shows at 68 venues around Maine. We had handmade paper and Presque Isle and sculptural works at Hay Gallery. I think it's always a matter of just educating people, because I would go to them, and it was slides at the time. I had slides from artist work, and people, Arts Commission members would say, well, what are we talking about with fiber? Hand knit mittens? And I would say, well, I knit mittens, but take a look at this. And every time I went to Turtle Gallery or Center for Contemporary Art or Portland Museum of Art, people would say, yes, let's give them a show. And we had a year of shows. Every 3 weeks we were at another opening. And it was spectacular. And I think it's important work, and we do it. Yeah.
All of you at some point during your presentations mentioned connection. You mentioned your knitting mentor and other mentors that you had worked with. You mentioned guilds, as well as people that you were connected to through your own designs. You mentioned modern artists using the same patterns that older artists, historic artists had used, and you directly use historic costumes, historic garments as your inspiration for modern garments. So you obviously feel that there's a sense of connection in the past, and as makers, I know all of you also feel that connection. You're all very aware of history. Do you feel that past makers, who, as we know, are working a lot on utilitarian objects for utilitarian purposes, do you think that they felt a sense of connection through their craft? Or do you think that they were just too busy doing it to even think about that?
I think that, well, one thing is I want to just, before I answer that, I want to just check in on with the costume clothing aspect. So clothing is what we wear. It's what protects us from the cold or the heat or the wet. And costume is the messages that our clothing conveys. So costume is cultural. It's not just Halloween. And every single one of us does this, and we send messages every time we get dressed. And I don't think there's very many of us who, unless it was a really unusual circumstance, would wear the same clothing that we wear in the garden to a wedding or a funeral. It would have to be a really unusual wedding or funeral for us to do that. So that's that thing. But in terms of connection, the fact that that originally it was men teaching men how to knit, And with quilting and embroidery, it was women teaching their daughters, I'm sure that there were times, especially when I'm gonna get choked up, someone's parent has died, like mine had. I think that it's very natural to think about the people that taught you. And so I get the same way with cooking, but you just think about the people who taught you this skill, and then you realize that there's this whole series of people behind you. And whether or not they went, umpteen generations, I don't know, but I would bet anything that they thought about their mothers and their sisters and their grandmothers when they were doing, when the women were quilting, for example, or doing needlework.
I would also extend that connection not just by the people that taught you, but specifically with women doing this work. It was also how to identify each other. Like, today we have wearing a safety pin, or, like different lipstick colors, or even, you can identify someone by the brand of sneakers that they wore. People were also using their clothing or this art to connect them with another community, whether that be from a community with shared skin colors or a community that shares the same message, like the suffragettes. They wore white costumes when they were marching because one made a striking photograph, but also if any of them was hurt, blood would be seen very clearly. So I think there is also a connection to speak to other people out there that might not knit, might not sew, but you're still in the same community.
Ask a follow-up question to that, actually, because I think that plays into something we were going to discuss, which is what the textile arts can be used for besides utilitarian purposes. You just touched on it, but does anybody want to expand on that more? Modern things that textiles are used for?
Sure. Yeah, I think I just showed a whole slideshow of what things can be used for more. I mean, they can make statements, they can bond families, they can talk about ancestry, they can talk about color and what delights you in the world. And even all the implications that we heard about in your knitting. That was very fascinating. And do we give this meaning, or is it larger than that? I mean, I think there are really amazing works. People do amazing things. And I think about all the people who come into Maine Fiber Arts to talk to me. And one woman came in, she had just taken a class, she said, it's all about the ancestors. We have this stuff running through our veins, and all of it talks about what we're going to do and what we're going to make. Now, that's just food for thought. You don't have to accept that, or you do. But yeah, fiber artwork. I remember a piece Catherine made about her mother dying of Alzheimer's, and it was a knitted shawl, and it started off in pattern, and then it started to break down in just big, long veins until it was strands of yarn hanging off the other edge. Stephen Petrov, a poet right here at Topsom, always talked about when you have a fire in the belly. And he meant that if you really have passion for something, you really have a message you want to convey, you can do that with anything you are making. Photographing, knitting, felting. And yeah, Kim Deegan once made him a beautiful vest with birds going up and down knitted. And he took one look and said, oh yeah, she really had a fire in the belly for that one. So that's what we can look for.
I think deep down that one of the things that all of us in our hearts wants is to know that we're not alone. Whether it's in a specific experience or just involving who we are as a person. Am I the only person that eats Cheerios at midnight and loves it? Just, am I weird? Like, we want to see a reflection of ourselves in other people because we are hardwired to crave that connection. And I think that all of this art that we do connects us with anybody else who practices that same art, even if they are completely different than we are in every single way. It's a way that we can see a little bit of ourselves in someone else, and that makes the other person feel safe or safer, comfortable, more familiar, more known, less of a threat. Because if you go back, far enough evolutionarily, if that's what you choose to believe, then we are always actively looking for threats and survival of the fittest. And I would say, having a middle school and a high school daughter now, that has not changed. The more that we can help them find those common things, the better. But it's a jungle out there. But I think all of us want to be held by other people in our hearts, and we also do want to hold space for other people in our hearts, and I think that this is kind of a bridge that enables us to do that.
I think too what you were saying about knitting and about kind of the meditative quality that can happen, and that can happen with any of the fiber arts, or almost any of them. I don't know that some of the dyeing is terribly, you have to pay attention with that more perhaps, but with weaving, weaving has a very, very fussy stage at the beginning where you have to pay a lot of attention, and you have to make sure those threads are going through the right, part of the reed, all these kinds of things. And then you start to weave, and it is one long meditation. And your whole body is moving in a rhythm, and it is an incredible experience. So I think that's another thing that you can also get when you're in the zone, if you're designing or sewing, or really when you're doing any art. You get into that zone, and time, it just flies. But weaving is a wonderful thing because it really is like a moving meditation. Another use, I guess.
That's a really good point, actually. One of the things that ties, no pun intended, all of the fiber arts together is that sense of repetition. Even the amazing garments that Viv creates are sewn together with stitches that are the same stitch, stitch, stitch. And there is that meditative quality to it, the process. Which I think brings me to the last question we have time for, because I do want to leave time for the audience to ask questions, which is, what role do tools play in the fiber arts? What's changed over time? You started to talk about that a little bit, Alicia, but also, does it impact the quality of the work? This ties in with accessibility. Can you do quality fiber art if you don't have, the best of the best tools or fiber?
I am so opinionated on this. I have used both the very best and the very worst. And I would say that all of it is meaningful and important and has a place in our industry, especially for reasons of accessibility. The wedding gown that you saw me wearing was actually hand designed by my husband's Uncle Frank. And he made it primarily out of very inexpensive materials at Joann Fabrics. And then I went to the store and I got some acrylic paint and I watered it down and I hand painted the hem. It looks like a much nicer gown than what the materials are. But because of the time and craftsmanship and intention that was put into it, it's beautiful. Would it be even more stunning in 100% silk? Probably. Did it matter to me? No. But good tools are also important.
You can do a lot with good tools, but if you don't have the skill and the vision and the fire in the belly, your work is not going to be as good. It doesn't matter if your paintbrush costs $450. You still won't be able to paint a painting that is going to be just boffo. And one thing that some tools did is they really did destroy the way we looked at certain fiber arts. If you look at, I'm thinking of weaving and that sort of meditative quality, the hand weaving, and then holy crap, you go into a weave shed for mechanical looms and it is loud and it is just devastating, and weavers went deaf, every single one of them, and it is mayhem, and it's real controlled mayhem, and it's really very different of an experience. And that also, I think, affected the way that we look at woven things. Is this something that a skilled artist is doing, or is this something that was produced by a machine? And so I think some of the tools probably worked against the idea of something being an art. I don't know. I'm also opinionated.
I can give a third opinion. 'Cause I know I've spoken about this before, and I have never really had a budget for great tools. Some of the best rulers that I've ever given was actually given to me by my professors when we started pattern drafting. And I still use them today, and I will carry them after graduation. But I think knowledge is the biggest tool, and one of the things that really bugs me, and I can be the little devil here, is with the rise of internet and knowledge being more accessible, it also brings it into the hands of people who think, oh, that's cool, I can do it. And I'm not saying they shouldn't try it, but when you have your Instagram Reels or your TikTok or YouTube just flooded with people who really don't know what they're doing, but they can act like they do. And, they can have a better sewing machine than I do, but they don't know the fabric or the thread that they're supposed to use, or how they're actually supposed to make this dress that they bought for $8 actually fit them. And it kind of bugs me because it's, it's kind of creating a little lie because it's showing other people, oh, they could do it, I could do it too, but they're then losing that knowledge. And they're actually making the art of tailoring and the art of sewing clothes or making your own clothes kind of less valuable, in my opinion. Then I'm not saying that it should be regulated to anybody, but I wish people would put more value in the learning of it, because that's the number one tool you need. It doesn't matter about anything else when you get down to it. So, yeah.
I think what Viv was indicating wasn't necessarily that the people shouldn't create, but that if you're going to learn and create as an amateur, not to set yourself up as somebody who is as somebody who is like a leading voice in the industry. I've been in the knitting industry long enough that when I first started, there was no social media. There was just Ravelry, the knitting website. You make the pattern, you put it up there, people buy it, they're happy. Now I have to make reels, I have to engage people. They want to see my face, they want to know my politics, they want to know about my private life. They want to know how long I've been doing this, what's my authority, where have I been educated. So, and I have to create constant content that not only draws you to click that little heart, but that compels you to write sentences on my page, because if it doesn't, the algorithm smushes me and doesn't show my stuff to anybody. I'm not kidding, it's stressful. That part is stressful, but yes, when the pandemic happened, what we saw in the knitting industry anyway, what I saw, and by all means, I am a self-started knitwear designer. I did a lot of work and study and research behind the scenes when I first, was starting out. And my stuff was priced accordingly. It's priced very differently now. There's other people and other professionals that are pulled in, test knitters, technical editors that I pay to fine tooth comb all of my work. But a bunch of people just coming in and saying, I can knit a square. It's a scarf. And I am fashionable. But what it does is it hypersaturates a market that is already very competitive. And so then there's different voices like, oh, well, you don't have to do it this way. And that is also true. But it does create a very different climate, I think, for retaining the artistic integrity of the craftsmanship, if that makes sense. So it should be accessible to everybody, but if you're going to set yourself up as one of the utmost voices on it, you need to have that knowledge and experience to back it up.
All right. Also, I think what I've heard between the lines a little bit too is attitude. It's attitude. Are you doing this because it means something to you? Are you approaching this as an artist? Or are you just trying to be like, save a buck or make a buck? And that's a big difference, I think, can be a big difference in what is art and what isn't art too, is what is your intention. Intention's a good word. So I'm going to open the floor up to some audience questions. So if you have a question, could you raise your hand and then I will pick somebody? Anybody have any questions, either for a particular person or about a particular craft? Any questions are good questions. Yes.
I'm wondering what Viv's experience has been as a recent student on this question of art versus craft. You know, what do your professors think about fashion?
So they've asked what is Viv's experience as a student on the question, the issue of art versus craft, and what their professors have to say about it as well.
I have to answer this carefully because I have a professor in the back. So I had a class my junior year that was all about what is craft, and the fashion and textiles department is pushed into the craft side, which I completely agree with because there is so much history and handwork and hard work behind it. I have a best friend who's a sculpture major, so I can rag on fine artists. But I know directly the fashion and textiles department at Mecca leans more towards not high fashion, but functional fashion. They really do help us. We learn the basics of patterns and constructions, and how to draft, and really be able to go out and not necessarily start a business in their own, but we know what we're doing. So when we need to go find jobs, we can help select for ourselves. We don't just have to go make haute couture pieces and really just have the weird high fashion stuff in our portfolios. I don't know if that really answered it. They do allow you to express yourself. If you want to go make crazy, funky, wearable puppets, they're going to allow you, and that's still going to be fashion. We're also awesome because we have textiles in our name. So if you want to go do weavings, I have one of my friends in the department is making ginormous weavings for their thesis because they didn't want to create garments, so they didn't have to. So yeah, they really let you express yourself, but the technique behind it is very important with whatever you're doing.
I'll sort of echo that as a Mecca dropout. I didn't do textiles, but I did metalsmithing. But I remember when we took drawing, drawing 101, we had to draw paper bags on the floor. But you have to learn that, it's what you were talking about before, about tools. It doesn't matter what tools you have, you've got to learn the techniques. So I think Mecca's doing a good job of that. Anybody else, questions? Anybody have any questions to put these guys on the spot? Any comments? Anybody want any information about PHC? Yeah.
It's been really nice to talk about handcraft again with this audience and with these panelists. And I realize how little I do of it. So that's interesting.
Yes. What about a little bit of show and tell before we wrap up?
Yes, I think what we'll do now is we'll thank the panelists, and then people can come up and talk to the panelists and look at the items if you'd like to, and ask questions of the panelists, if that sounds okay. But let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you. Whoever made off with Alicia's swatch, you're cleaning. See, thanks.